I would like to now introduce our next presenter, Lara Dagamseh, and she is a graduate student in theology department, and she has an undergrad degree in psychology and theology both at Huron University College. She also has an undergrad degree in chemical engineering from the Technology University in Baghdad. She has worked with children with disabilities who are just landed in Canada as refugees. She also worked in cross-cultural learning center with refugee families in their settlement process and their special needs. Currently, she works with the Muslim Resource Center in London in the Strengthening Families program. Her current research, graduate research, is focused on the impact of COVID-19 on the development of children's spirituality due to traumatic lockdown in March 2020. The title of her talk is Talking to Children and Youth about God during COVID-19 pandemic, grounded by the directions of the Quran and the Sunnah. Exactly what we need. We are very excited to have you with us today. Dear Lara, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for the organizers and for the amazing work and this informative conference. In this presentation, I will be talking about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the measures that came with it on children's development and well-being. Next slide. More than ever, we need to come together to support children to survive and thrive through this difficult time. Children and adolescents are among the groups that will live the longest with the pandemic's consequences. We need to support them at so many levels to minimize harm and maximize positive developmental outcomes. Decision makers who activate specific measures to mitigate the spread of the virus actually should consider the impact of these measures on children. The needed interventions must be provided through multiple channels on a policy making level, on an interventional level, on an institutional level related to healthcare and education. The intervention strategies relevant to the current conference are the holistic approach and that considers individual differences, cultural competency, and religious background to support mental health and spiritual being of children. Next slide. The pandemic lockdown presented itself to children and adolescents with intense media coverage, sickness and life death related fear and anxiety, uncertainty, unlimited unknowns, and political polarizations and conflict. These disturbing dynamics happened and escalated on a global scale and will alter the pre-pandemic predicted developmental outcomes. These dynamics will change how children are developing, and ramping up services and support around children is a priority to help communities mitigate the negative consequences of the crisis on our future, embodied in the young generation's mental health. Professionals, first line workers, physicians, pediatricians need to need to be prepared with evidence-based therapeutic and supportive interventions. Also, parents, teachers, religious leaders, and caregivers who are in close contact with children need to be cautious when choosing religious discourse to support children during any difficult time, because it will shape their cognition, neurodevelopment, and spiritual development. We need to support children to survive, thrive, and transcend through this experience. This is achievable goal if we as a community think critically about the holistic well-being of the new generations and how our religious and spiritual experiences are being delivered to these young souls. Next slide. I'm going to be talking about two major types of trauma that children were exposed to. The first one is due to sudden lockdown, and the other one is related to the quarantine period. And I will give more details in the next slide. Children have been in lockdown for months while not having access to trusted adults outside their households. It has generated a life threat related fear and anxiety due to the overwhelming media coverage. Measures to confront the pandemic resulted in schools closure. Just in USA, back in March, 55 million children were outside schools. The lockdown began by disturbing children's daily routines, disconnecting educational process and recreational activities, which means for many children is a disconnection from mental health services and nutrition sources for those coming from low income families. According to Statistics Canada, 15% of Canadians reported food insecurity in their household, putting many children at risk of malnutrition. Many children depend on schools for social services and mental health interventions. Some of them depend on it for stress relief if they live in a complex family dynamics. Schools for many children is the only safe space to socialize, learn, and thrive. And being disconnected from all those resources is traumatizing event from children's perspective. And the implications of this dynamic will continue to escalate for years. Knowing that suicide is a leading cause for death for children 10 to 14 years old in Canada, it is expected that these numbers are going to be impacted by the pandemic. Next slide. The second type of, oh, before the second type, actually, these are risk factors for the lockdown. So, low income households that cannot replace the school resources by home provided resources, racial and ethnic minorities, such as newly immigrated families who are still adjusting to their new environment, pre-existing complex family dynamics that are expected to escalate during lockdown, pre-existing mental health disorders such as autism spectrum disorder that is negatively impacted by the social isolation, and individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder who will struggle with escalated anxiety of being contaminated by the virus. Also, pre-existing complex medical conditions such as cancer. All these factors and dynamics are risking the mental health and the well-being of children and youth due to the current public health crisis. Next slide. The second type of trauma I'm going to be talking about is being unsafe behind closed doors. And we all know how critical is this. And there's an emerging evidence that adverse childhood experiences are increasing during the pandemic. Those experiences can be defined as any form of abuse, neglect, maltreatment that children may experience. There are also pre-pandemic indicators that lead us to think that this pandemic is deeply intimidating for children. 78% of those experiences was done by child's parent, and 45 of those children who were experienced this adverse childhood experiences in the United States are coming from Black, non-Hispanic communities, and 51 are Hispanic communities, which means those are high numbers. Um, these numbers elaborate how complex is the situation for those children during the pandemic. And for children to be in isolation with stressed parents due to the lockdown, which will increase the likelihood of those experiences to happen again. The pandemic distress economic implications is actually another risk factor for being with a stressed parent. If you just think by uh, the by what in 1 month in the US, 22 million unemployment claims were filed in 1 month, which means there's an increased financial stressors on parents that will increase the risk factors in for child abuse. Also, it is well documented that parental mental health problems, substance use and abuse, employment uncertainty, financial stress, and disturbed family routines can increase adverse childhood experiences. During the pandemic lockdown, social services and child welfare workers were unable to visit families who were under their care before the pandemic. Also, it is unlikely that a stranger will report a child abuse because it is happening in isolation behind doors, and it's undefined. He's like no one's unable to define it. All those taken together can actually lead us to think that children have been trapped in an abusive situations with no support and no documenting of those incidents. Exploiting children's psychospiritual dynamic due to trauma can be a starting point to provide children the empowerment that they need to overcome the implications of the pandemic. Let's go to next slide. Yeah, thank you. In this, before I will talk about how the traumatic experiences will impact spiritual being, I will talk about, I'll give a brief overview on the stages of development of faith development. This will help us understand a variety of developmental outcomes that are expected to appear in the future. It is important to value individual differences between children and remember that each child is expected to experience this pandemic in his or her own unique way. Next slide, please. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're now in the right one. Okay. So I'm just going to give a quick overview on Fuller's model of faith development, which was inspired by Lawrence Goldberg's notion of moral development. It is 6 stages of development, but we will talk about the first three stages just to kind of take a home to take a message of how could possibly these experiences impact children. So before the first 3 stages, there is the pre-stage, which is undifferentiated faith during infancy, and there is no identifiable religion or faith. From a developmental perspective, the child has a small cortex, a minimal brain activity. The child has no recognizable developed cognition. The child's relationship with the world is based on survival needs. Exploiting infants during the first 2 years of life will result in many forms of problematic development, such as insecure attachment with the caregiver, physical impairments, and emotional dysregulation. Um, a, a great actually research question is whether infant exploitation and maltreatment during this stage can possibly predict specific patterns of spirituality and religiosity. As we in Islamic discourse, we talk about clear fitra, and then the fitra of this child is still clear, and we as caregivers will impact by being mindful about every action and word we direct towards infants. The first stage after the pre-stage is is the projective phase. It's 2 to 6 years old. During this period of time, there is a high brain connectivity, and the brain is highly responsive to every environmental and sensational input. The brain connectivity of 2 years old child is higher and faster than adults' brain connectivity. The high connectivity corresponds with highly active imagination, fantasies. Therefore, they find it difficult to distinguish imagination from reality. Child integrate the parents and the societal concept of God and life meaning with his or her own imagination to create stories and mental images of God. If the child's environment is abusive or unresponsive to the child's needs, then this will distort the child's imagination and disturb their grasp of reality as well, and possibly slow down their creativity. All these unpleasant dynamics will integrate with the societal perception of spirituality and meaning of life to establish the child's perception of God. The next stage is the mythic literal faith, which is school aged 6 to 10-year old. During this stage, myths and symbols and philosophical concepts can only be understood in a literal interpretation. This is a very critical stage in spiritual development. If the child is abused by a parent or an authority figure, such as a teacher, using an authoritarian religious discourse, then this will lead the child to develop a literal perception of God based on the abusive discourse employed. At this stage, the child can form some personal judgment, but it is very dependent on adults' role in the judgments process. At this stage, our religious discourse will shape and form children's religious and faith development and will continue to direct them for a long period of time. The last stage that we're going to talk about is the conventional stage. It's age 12 to 18. At this age, most of the cortical development progress occurring during this, it happens during this period of time. The abstract thinking, decision making, considering the consequences of one's choices develops largely by not completely during these years. Exploiting the adolescent's autonomy during this stage can cause impairments in and these skills they need to develop critical thinking. It is crucial for adolescents to continue to develop their spirituality, to develop their critical thinking, and that's why it's important to consider the adolescent's autonomy while developing these skills. Examples of exploiting the adolescent's autonomy would be suppressing their philosophical questions and forcing them to perform specific rituals without explaining the role of these rituals in improving their relationship with God. All forms of abuse at this stage can cause severe, harmful impacts on their brain development, and this is a very complex stage since there is a lot going on with child on a multidimensional process. You can think of puberty, cognitive development, identity development, hormonal changes, peer pressure, body image changes. All those together can actually be very complex for adolescents. It's a stage where the child become very self-centered, and any religious discourse or religious activity can only be interpreted through their own self-perception and concepts. The effective religious and spiritual discourse for this age group should include elements of empathy and conditional love, God's forgiveness and acceptance of adolescents' imperfections. I'm not going to talk about the other stages because they are beyond the scope of this presentation, but the take home message from doing this brief description is that every act, every word, implicit idea, explicit idea, in a positive or a negative way, will change something about our children, and it will matter for their spiritual development and well being. During this difficult time, we need to pay more attention to children to help them navigate their path out of this current pandemic. Now, next trauma and uh, uh, yes, okay. Now, before I go also to give an elaboration on trauma and spirituality and how it could how it could change how the spiritual development, it's just briefly I'm gonna define spirituality to make it more clear, which is it's a perception of unlimited value and meaning of the self and the world, and this perception is connected to mental health and overall well-being. Another definition I'm going to give, which is a negative core beliefs about God. These core beliefs are cognitive distortions connected to negative experiences that disturb the person's spiritual being and will cause the trauma victims uh, to endorse these cognitive errors, and it will play negative role in their healing process. These beliefs are directly and deeply connected with the pain that the child experiences during a traumatic event. These core beliefs shape the perception of the self and the perception of God as a source of unlimited meaning, value, and abundance. Therefore, the discussion of these core beliefs does not intend to change someone's religion or spiritual position, but the goal is to navigate the therapeutic opportunities by scrutinizing those negative core beliefs. I will talk about the two of those negative core beliefs and ways to respond to them. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. This happens during the traumatic event. Let's say we will expect this to be happened already during the pandemic, during the lockdown, is the locus of control shift. In the traumatic and abusive experience lead to the self-concept of unworthy, unlovable, and self-blame of the harm. These perceptions continue to escalate over the span of spiritual development to become core beliefs about God. For the victims to cope with their sense of unworthy, they develop a cognitive error that God is a passive power who can intervene to help but chooses not to do so. Consequently, the child starts to believe that he or she is responsible for being abused and should be in absolute control of his or her life, since there is not an invisible superpower who can intervene. The response to this cognitive error is, in the case of abuse, is by highlighting that God is just and gave all people, including the abuser, the free will and the free of choice, and he or she made the bad choice. The victim as well has the privilege of free will to make unethical choices, and the positive consequences will come from God, which means it will give the person the free will to choose ethical choices, to heal and to be nice, like to respond in a positive way to their trauma. Next, please. Okay, the second, actually, this is the second negative core belief that we will talk about, is God as a moody, tyrant, or and like not being nice to people. I didn't know how to pronounce this one. Is the second core belief. So I will discuss one of the common ways used in to cope with trauma and grief, that we believe that this is coming from God. So we believe that the pandemic is coming from God, or the abusive situation is coming from God. And this is an effective approach to accept the situation. It is used actually by dialectical behavioral therapy, in the name of it is radical acceptance, and it's used to treat suicidal ideation and bipolar disorder. However, using this strategy with children is not safe and can cause long-lasting spiritual harm to the child's spiritual and faith development. Why? Because attributing every harm, negative events, loss, and traumatic events to God, to God's Messiah. So saying that this is God's Messiah will lead the child to ask in an implicit manner why God chooses to do harmful things to us. The answer would be one of the two options. One, if it's something about the self, about ourself as an individual or as a group. So something about us that we deserve that, or something about God as a superpower who chooses to do something mean to us. And both answers are harmful for the child's spiritual development. The approach of radical acceptance can be helpful with adults, but possibly harmful with children, because it does not allow the child to express feeling, questions, and concerns. Children can only be heard by recognizing their feelings and validating them. Therefore, our religious discourse that we are using with children need to be modified to recognize and validate the feelings, the concerns, the fears of children, to be able to hear their voices. The best way to like radical acceptance can be used in another way, which can we can take children step by step with these concerns to actually make them eventually accept the situation. And one way, actually, I can give an example about a child is asking why God would choose to make us suffer from this virus of this pandemic. There is the best response, and that also depend on the stage that the child is in, so it's always needs to be modified to match the age group. But what we can respond by saying that, that God is just, and as we as and as you as a child is growing and changing, God give this opportunity for every entity to grow and change. Then and what happened is that this virus is developing and changing. The pandemic is a result of its developing, and our and what happened after this virus is developing and changing, that we are impacted by the change that happened to this virus. But the question is, are we left alone to face this scary consequences of the mutation of the virus? No, God give us one of the blessings that we can count is the science and innovation that we have. I think that I have to go to the last slide. Yeah, I jumped on myself. Okay. Yeah, that this is the last slide, that we can count on science and innovation, and this is will help children actually rely more on science, rely more on reliable science, and know that this is one of the tools that we can use to survive the situation. So this makes them grounded in like making the mask as part of their daily routine. They understand that why we're doing that. They can actually put in their the all the they comply to all the measures needed. So this will take children through the process of using their reason, their which is created by God, to be confident and trust the science and go with it. I yes, and yeah, thank you everyone for listening. And this is what I wanted to say. I just wanted to uh, be uh, be very. I want to say just we need to hear the voices of children.
Thank you so much, Lara. We appreciate your presentation. Lara examined the spiritual challenges due to COVID-19 crisis from children's developmental perspective. It's very important to see how the pandemic may affect children and the challenges that they go through, and how we need to empower children and their conception of God and their realization of this development.